Yeah, thanks for that introduction. And so these are my disclosures. If you have any questions about that, let me know. I am a consultant and an advisory board member on a recovery social network site called SoberGrid. I don't have any financial stake in everything I'm talking about today. I certainly have a bias. I want them to work and help people, but I don't personally have any financial stake in them. So this first slide tells a story, right? And if you look, it's probably hard, I'm realizing, to see the specifics, so I can just sort of tell the story. The long and the short of it is that there are, in any given year, between 20 and 22 million people that meet criteria for substance use disorder. And those numbers always skew higher among 18 to 25-year-olds. I have this area of interest in emerging adulthood, which is really developmental period, less so an age range, but we think about it as very much mapping on to the college years, and so it's really exciting for me to be at VCU and to be giving this talk here today. At the same time, one of the things we know is that only 11%, roughly 10 or 11% of adults with SUD, with substance use disorder, seek any kind of service whatsoever. That includes treatment, mutual help organizations, going to one's physician to help address substance use, right? And the narrative around this is, well, it's about treatment access. So people are not going to treatment because they don't have access, because our healthcare system has barriers and insurance. And there certainly is a way in which that's true. At the same time, when you ask people who have a substance use disorder, adults who don't go to specialty treatment, why not? 95% say they didn't think they needed it, right? So there are a couple different ways of thinking about that. One is certainly, well, maybe they weren't ready, quote unquote, or maybe they need, so maybe you think, okay, there was with some motivational interviewing or some more consequences in their life, maybe they'll become ready. I think a big piece of the puzzle here also is the way in which we think about treatment in the US as something that requires upending one's life, where you have to make a huge major life commitment to broad scale changes. And I think that probably is necessary for a subset of people with SUD. But SUD, as we know, is a very heterogeneous disorder. On the more moderate to severe end, people might need to upend their lives, right, to make major changes. At the same time, I think there's probably a degree, I'm realizing this laser pointer is not going to work, but there is a degree to which when we think about treatment as currently conceptualized in our country, a lot of people may not need that to make a change in their substance use to reduce the harms. So that's one kind of piece of the story here. Second piece of the story, for people that do show up to treatment, 60% are going to drink or use other drugs in that first year. Some people will call that relapse, some people don't, either which way, right? We're not that good at helping people once they do go to treatment maintain those gains over time. Lots of reasons why that's true. A lot of you guys know that. Finally, the third piece here is that there are 1.5 to 2 million people who are in recovery from substance use disorder and remission, who are seeking services. And so there are ways in which, and we think about the kind of relapse risk, not really dropping to meet the relapse risk of the general population until about 5 years in remission. And so there's a need for these ongoing long-term recovery management services. And then the last piece, and it's a thread throughout this talk today, I'm going to talk about 3 different studies that we've done. And one of my personal interests is around this developmental period, this life stage of emerging adulthood. Emerging adults have always been traditionally very challenging to get into treatment, to help stay in treatment, or other kinds of recovery support services. The panel before was talking about some of those things. I wrote a paper, and there's a few different reasons why that's true. I think a big reason is the social and community aspect, where socially, drinking and other drug use is far more reinforced than abstinence and recovery, especially for young people. That's why I love collegiate recovery programs and think we need to learn more about them. So what I'm going to purport to you today is that social network sites, right, so social media, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what I mean when I say that. What I purport is that social network sites are a way to help address those 3 treatment needs. Not fix them all, but help address them, right? So in terms of some terminology, social networks are, when I say social networks, I'm talking about a model of connections between and among people, either in real space, right? Like you all have social networks, your friends, your family, you have social networks whether you're in recovery, out of recovery, we've all got social networks. And one of the things we know is that the composition of somebody's social network is going to make a difference in terms of onset of substance use disorder and offset, right? So when you're talking about treatment and recovery, one of the more robust mechanisms of behavior change, in other words, what explains how treatment helps, how mutual help organizations like AA help, is by helping people change up their social networks, by adding people to their networks that are either abstinent or in recovery themselves or support their recovery, and dropping people from their networks that are drinkers or other drug users who don't support their recovery. Big piece of how this stuff works. And then when we do qualitative work, Allison Labby's, we did our postdoc together, and she did a qualitative study looking at young adults, 18 to 24-year-olds that were going to meetings, and they asked them, what did you find helpful, what didn't you find helpful, and what they found helpful mapped onto these factors about a shared experience, feeling some sense of connection to other people who are like them, right? So for some of you guys in the audience, it's probably like a no duh. At the same time, for the kind of academic community, I think this was something of an important discovery on which we can say, okay, we're gaining a better understanding of the social mechanisms of recovery. Now, how do we tap into those? So when it comes to the use of technology in treatment and recovery, this is nothing new, even though it's getting talked about quite a bit more nowadays. So back in the 90s, there was ways in which empirically supported treatments were being delivered via computer, right? And that little icon with the clipboard, that's the clinician. That's what the clipboard means, they're a clinician. That's what differentiates them from the person. Then, right, the technology became more sophisticated, and they started to be able, the technology was able to adapt to the person, right? So the person would input information about who they are and what they want, and the treatments were able to adapt to the person or become tailored to them. And now there's ways in which we can use technology to measure psychophysiology, other kinds of things within a person. And here's what I'm interested in, is the ways in which we can use technology to connect people to other people, and also to empirically supported interventions. And that's really the crux of the talk here. So before I get to the actual studies themselves, I just want to make sure we're on the same page in terms of terminology again. So when I say social network sites, and I'll usually use the acronym, if you see SNS on my slides, I'm talking about social network sites. Social network sites are a kind of social media where people create profiles, have observable and navigable connections to other people, create and interact with user-generated content or user-shared content, right? And so examples are like in the kind of general interest social network sites, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, not Snapchat so much. Snapchat's more of a messaging app, right? So on these sites, you're establishing social networks, and you can see people's social networks and who's interacting with whom. So they're very, very popular, as many of you know. 70% of US adults are using social network sites, and way more, that percentage increases to 88% when you're talking about young adults that are 18 to 29. And you guys might be asking, well, yeah, but what about people that are in treatment or in recovery? The number's actually pretty similar. If you look in the bottom left-hand corner, Rob Ashford, Brenda Curtis, and some folks I work with in Penn, they do some really cool stuff on social media and how to use social media to predict relapse risk, but they just surveyed these adults in intensive outpatient program and asked them if they were using social network sites and things like this. And the rate's pretty similar, about 70% are using it. And then in a study, I think this was a Washington, D.C. based study actually of treatment, a largely African-American sample. If you look down, if you look at the row that says own a smartphone, over 70%, this was after they left treatment, over 70% own a smartphone. But now a little bit of a teaser, if you look further down, you see the contract type. About 50% were on pay-as-you-go plans, so their kind of ability to be accessing smartphones ongoing is a little tenuous, and so we'll bring that back up in a little bit. Well, what research has been done so far to say, well, can we use, social network sites are cool and people are using them, but can we actually use them to make a difference in terms of treatment and recovery? The long and the short of it is we really don't know. One of the things that you'll hear, I think, in my talk is I bring up a whole lot of questions. I don't have too many answers for you just yet, unfortunately. And I'll talk about what some of those questions are at the very end. But social network sites have been used to help with other kinds of health behavior change, physical activity, weight loss, smoking cessation. And there are limited data targeting online forums and communities for alcohol, other drugs. There's a study that I'm going to talk about, the second study, where we actually carried out a survey of folks that are using a recovery-specific social network site called In the Rooms, like Rachel mentioned. And so what's been shown so far is people are going on there with a range of goals. They kind of jump in and then back off a little bit, so their level of engagement is fairly modest. The data so far has focused on the content and not the people. So when it comes to actual outcomes and who's using them and how they do over time and whether they derive any benefit from participating on these online forums, we really don't have a very good idea of that empirically. On the flip side, right, so I'm also interested not only in how to use social network sites to help leverage or enhance recovery outcomes, I'm also interested in understanding, are there ways in which social network sites might be risky, especially for young people and especially for young people that are trying to make a change in their substance use for young people in recovery. So there is an emerging literature, for example, on college students, not necessarily college students with substance disorder or in recovery, but that show that the more they use social network sites, the more likely they are to be exposed to content that glorifies or romanticizes alcohol, other drug use. And then in a little bit, there's a little bit of data, not too much, to show longitudinally, if you look at these folks over time, that kind of exposure actually does lead to or accounts for some increase in alcohol and other drug use, or actually really just alcohol use. And so before I move on to the studies, one thing you might be thinking is when I talk about social network sites, and anybody who spent time on there will know what I'm talking about, right? There's a very big difference between Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and even Snapchat, even though it's not a social network site, in terms of the culture on there, right? And kind of how things work. And there's some data, for example, to suggest that young people are more likely to post about their drinking on Instagram versus Facebook, probably because parents are on Facebook more now, et cetera, right? And so there's a meme that I love, and you guys might have seen it, right? And it helps describe the different cultures, and I think it's important to conceptualizing that even when we're talking about recovery sites, each recovery site's gonna have its own culture. But so when you think about the major social network sites, the meme goes like this, and sort of what the culture is on there, right? So Instagram has a lot of posts about alcohol, social, so it's Instagram is my life as a party. Facebook is my life turned out great. Snapchat is my life as a quirky TV show. And Twitter is we're all gonna die. And Twitter's my favorite, so. So with that, we'll move on into the research and the objectives of the talk. I'm gonna talk, first I'm sort of gonna go broad to narrow, right? I'm gonna take a big broad look at how individuals that are former problem substance users, and I'll tell you what I mean there, how are they already using online technology to aid their substance use change or their recovery efforts. And then I'm going to talk a bit about a recovery-specific site called In the Rooms and folks who are using it. And then I'm going to talk about a smaller study that we did looking at young adults that were presenting for an outpatient evaluation and how they're using social network sites and whether they're being exposed to some of this alcohol and other drug content. And at the very end, I'll talk about some questions for the field and some things that I'm interested in as well. So the research, for the first study, my primary research question is how prevalent is use of online technology to make a change in substance use, or what I'll call recovery-related use of online technology. It's, the acronym is ROOT that we use here. And then what factors are associated with that? So what kinds of demographic factors are associated with a greater likelihood of using social network sites and other online technologies to aid recovery? And also what kinds of clinical factors, substance use severity, things like that. So these data come from the National Recovery Study. My mentor and I, John Kelly, have been publishing quite a bit from this data set. And it's a nationally representative sample of US adults who, quote unquote, used to have a problem with alcohol or drugs but no longer do. That's how they identify. And there's a paper that'll be coming out pretty soon that looks just at people who identify as being in recovery. It's about half of them who do that, right? And so other things in terms of the sample, not everybody was abstinent, right? People were talking about resolving a problem, but half were completely abstinent and half were using some substance, whether it's alcohol, another drug, et cetera. And only half had used some kind of service, whether that's treatment, mutual help organizations, or other kinds of services. And this is just a little bit more about the sample. I think the only other thing I want to point out here before I move on, if you look on the right-hand, the table on the right-hand side, that's the breakdown of the primary problem substance these folks identified. And so you see 13% didn't identify a primary substance, but the majority identified alcohol, which is not that surprising given the burden of alcohol and alcohol problems relative to other drugs. So in terms of defining how we define online technology use, anybody that said lifetime they used an online mutual help organization, so had attended an online AA meeting, online NA meeting, had used a social network site, what I call general interest sites, so that's like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and recovery-specific sites are their sites, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, that function, and look a whole lot like the social network sites that many people are familiar with, but cater to individuals that are either in recovery from SUD or seeking recovery, and then other kinds of online resources, including smartphone apps. We took a look, we had these demographics, and these were the clinical and substance factors that we were looking at. And essentially, what we were trying to see is over and above their demographics, right? So even when you control for those things, are there characteristics about these folks and their clinical and substance use histories that would make it more likely for them to have used online technology? So here are the findings. 11% of them had a history of recovery-related use of online technology, naturalistically speaking. So that's not 11% of the US population, that's 11% of these former problem substance users. And what that ends up amounting to is like 1%, essentially, of the US population, or about 2.35, I think, I have it on the next slide, million individuals. And you see that online mutual help organizations are the most popular form of recovery-related online tech use. And when you look at social network sites, in combination, about 7%, and less so. This other category, it's a bit misleading to say other because I think smartphone apps are fairly popular. But so where it gets a little bit confusing is that many smartphone apps are social network sites as well. So even recovery sites, they have both a web-based platform and a smartphone platform. So the way that question was asked was like smartphone apps that were not also social media. So in terms of the correlates, there are some that are not that surprising and some that were fairly surprising to me. So younger age was a predictor of recovery-related use of online technology. Not that surprising. What was surprising was that less than a high school education compared to high school grads, that predicted recovery-related use of online technology. That's surprising to me because typically education, higher levels of education is a predictor of more use of social media. That's sort of what I expected. And Hispanic individuals were more likely to engage with recovery online technology than white folks. There were no other differences in terms of race, ethnicity. And again, this was also surprising that lower income individuals were more likely to use recovery online technology than higher income individuals. Did not expect that. So when it comes to clinical factors, if you look at the graph on the left, what that shows us is that criminal justice history seems to play a role, at least in terms of the correlation, where having been arrested and going through drug courts makes it more likely for somebody to use online technology. We don't necessarily know why. We could think about that a little bit, compared to other criminal justice histories. And then if you look at the right, two kinds of service markers, one being having taken anti-craving, anti-relapse medication for substance use was a predictor of recovery online tech use. And so were other kinds of recovery support services, not counting mutual help organizations. So those are things like collegiate recovery programs, recovery community centers. And some other correlates you see on the bottom left-hand corner: younger age of first use, more psychological distress. And part of the story there with that younger age of first use and having been younger, and then if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, time since problem resolution, even though it wasn't statistically significant, there was a pretty large difference, 4 years difference. So that people, and the story there is, if you were younger, you were more likely to have started using earlier, and you had a shorter amount of time since you had resolved your problem, right? And so essentially what that's telling me is that it's probably a cohort effect. Younger people are more likely to use recovery online technology because when they made that change, there was more technology available. I suspect that as this younger cohort gets older, they're going to be using technology just the same. It's not about young versus old. It's just about availability of technology versus less availability of technology. So here's a brief summary. When you extrapolate that out at 11%, about 2.5 million US adults are already using online technology to either help them cut back on their substance use, abstain from substances, or quote unquote straight from their recovery. And that's really without any strong dissemination efforts. We're seeing more articles come out, but by and large, the technologies that are being used right now, or that you're seeing a lot written about, are proprietary and commercialized, and you really can't get access to them unless you're at a treatment program that's licensed them. So there hasn't been too much dissemination of these things. At the same time, so we know that there's broad reach. At the same time, we know very little about the effectiveness of these technologies from an empirical perspective. And the impact, when we think about, for example, mutual help organizations, when you think about the benefit, we know about the empirical benefit provided by them, and they're also ubiquitous. They're everywhere. all the time, especially if you go into cities. And so what really broadens or increases their impact is not only their effectiveness, but also their reach, right? And so that's a big piece of the puzzle when it comes to online technology. We know a whole lot more about its reach. We know very little about its effectiveness. I talked about this effective younger age. And then, the last thing I'll say about these data is I think it brings up some challenges for those of us that work in the area and for clinicians and techies who are developing these social network site apps, et cetera, to think about. One is, if in fact that's sort of a real effect, right, that individuals that are more severe are more likely to use recovery online technology. I suspect that's about severity being related to increased motivation to do something different and a willingness to try lots of different things, as many things as possible, right? So if that's true, folks with greater severity are going to have more cognitive challenges, especially at the beginning, in the beginning of the recovery process. And so developers are going to have to think about how are people navigating these things, right? And then the second piece is that I do suspect that if folks are more severe and are lower income, lower SES, their access to technology is going to be more tenuous. And so I think it's important for developers to be thinking about creating these technologies on multiple platforms. For example, somebody has a smartphone, right? They may lose access to that smartphone or to their internet access or what have you, but if it's web-based, they could also go to their local public library and get on that way, or go to a recovery community center and get on that way. So now I'm going to move on, and we're going to narrow the focus a little bit and talk about a specific social network site that does cater to individuals in recovery, and that's called intherooms.com. And like I talked about before, I do research on these platforms, but I don't have any financial stake, and it is key to note it is a for-profit platform. I always like to point that out. So there are these three major research questions: is how are people engaging on it? What resources are they using? The second question for me is, do they perceive benefit from participating? And the third question is, I'm very interested in understanding, like, can these resources be used both for folks that are not in recovery, in early recovery, or actually in kind of sustained remission or medium to late, medium to kind of more established recovery? And that's a lingering question for me. And so I wanted to compare folks with less than a year of abstinence or who are not abstinent at all to those that had a year or more of abstinence. So these data were published, and you can take a look in some of the finer details. So I'll probably skip over most of the method just for the sake of time. And there's a panel I know at the end, and you can ask me more questions about that. I do want to tell you a little bit about what In the Rooms is. So it's freely available to anybody. It's non-professional. It's very much like a recovery community that exists completely online. It looks and functions a whole lot like Facebook. At the same time, it has recovery-specific resources on there. So it has live online video meetings. Most of the meetings are 12-step. They have a few secular meetings. I know they just got a smart meeting as well. But if you go on, you'll see the philosophy is very much a 12-step philosophy of recovery. And here are two screenshots that the CEO and COO sent me and allow me to use that are de-identified. And so on your left is an example of kind of what a live online video meeting looks like. And you see somebody on a webcam, and you don't have to be on a webcam, but you can if you want to. So you can just go on, observe, listen, right? Or you can participate and share. And then on the right is kind of an example of what the homepage looks like. So again, here's a little bit about the method. It was a survey that we did on 123 members. On average, they had seven years absent, and here we weren't looking at quote-unquote problem resolution. We were interested more in abstinence versus non-abstinence because it was a recovery-specific site, and lots of reasonable people disagree. But by and large, when we think about recovery, most people think about that as no use of illicit substances or non-medical use of illicit substances. And so that circle is about showing you that 35% had less than a year or were not abstinent at all. So a decent chunk of the sample when we compare people who are abstinent for a year or more versus those who are in their first year of recovery or not in recovery at all. A little bit more about the sample. Again, I'm going to kind of skip over this just for the sake of time. So how are they participating? Well, by and large, they were logging into the site several times per week daily or several times per day, and when they logged on, they were doing so for about 30 minutes at a time, or more, right? So the average user, these are folks who responded to the survey, so it's certainly a sample, a biased sample in that way. That's important to point out. We did pay them, and so that reduces the likelihood that only super motivated people that love the site would participate. We wanted to get a mix of people, maybe people who didn't like the site also. The average user, or the kind of modal users, participating several times a week for 30 minutes at a time of active use, and that participation or engagement was similar for people both in early recovery or that had less than a year versus those with a year or more. If anything, it kind of skewed more towards more participation for people that were earlier, which makes sense in some ways. People that are earlier feel like they need more support in all likelihood to maintain their recovery. And here's what they're participating on or how they're engaging. In the Rooms has a daily meditation feature that you can get sent to your email or the front of your, the wall like Facebook. A lot of folks are participating in video meetings here. The blue bar is for those that had a year or more. The red bar is for those with less than a year or not abstinent. And you can kind of see, again, there were not really any statistically significant differences. But if you just kind of look descriptively, you do see the red bar tends to be a little bit higher than the blue bar, suggesting, again, that people that are a little bit earlier on are engaging a little bit more often and with a wider range of resources. And then we asked them, we wanted to get a sense of, do you perceive benefit from participating on the site? Like I mentioned before, just to clarify, right, we didn't measure their outcomes over time. This was a one-shot deal where we surveyed them at one point in time. But when we asked them about their motivation for abstinence and how their participation in the Rooms has increased their motivation, how it's increased their self-efficacy, or in other words, their confidence to stay abstinent over the next 90 days, whether it's reduced their craving for alcohol and other drugs, or whether it's increased their identity as a person in recovery, which is something that we don't talk about that much on the research side of things, but folks in recovery talk about a lot, and one of the strongest predictors of getting involved in AA and doing well over time is identifying as a member of AA. So it's something I'm particularly interested in, is recovery identity and social identity. But anyways, generally speaking, the participants perceived or agreed that the site was helpful. Again, this is all their self-report, and so take that with a grain of salt. The thing that sticks out for me the most is that level of agreement was similar for those with less than a year or a year or more, right? I actually did sort of hypothesize that if you had a year or more, you might be socialized to saying like, yeah, these recovery resources are helpful to me. But it was similar, both for those with less than a year and for those with a year plus. So what are the implications of this, right? Clearly, this is bringing up, again, questions for me more so than answers. But I think what it does say is rigorous investigations of these social network sites as recovery support services, modern recovery support services, are certainly warranted. And I think the NIAAA and the NIH agree with me. I'll let you know in the next few weeks. We'll see. And I do think that it can be used not only as a kind of a way to help folks self-manage. So maybe people don't want to go to a meeting or don't want to go to treatment. Would they be willing to engage in these sites that have a much lower barrier for access and don't take much motivation to get on there, right? And can it be used as an adjunct to clinical services? Especially, we did some qualitative data, we collected some qualitative data that I haven't analyzed yet, but I just took a quick peek at from these folks that were using the site. And we asked them what you found helpful, what you didn't find helpful, and one of the most prominent things that came up about what they found helpful was the convenience and the accessibility. So people that were maybe going to meetings, but their work schedule didn't allow it, or they couldn't get child care, or they lived in a rural area and didn't have as many access to meetings. So I think that's a big piece of this. And then for me, it's also like, what is it about these sites that's helpful, if they are helpful? Is it the activities? Is it the social support? Is it just the feeling or the knowledge that there's a community of people out there, much in the way that AA and other mutual help organizations can be helpful to folks in collegiate recovery programs and the community recovery aspects of that? Does that translate to the online space? I don't know. We'll see. And then, like I said before, as a clinical, a field of clinicians and clinical researchers, we've been fairly stumped in a lot of ways by young adults, especially young adults who are fairly resistant early on. It's like, how do you engage them given how limited recovery supportive environments and people are out there, right? Like, collegiate recovery programs are not everywhere, and especially collegiate recovery programs like this. So there are certainly challenges that we have about engaging young people with recovery supportive people and resources. And I'm really interested to see, like, are these recovery social network sites ways to do that? And a few different hypotheses, right? So, like, for example, one thought I have is, before I move on to the last study here, can it be a standalone recovery support? We'll see. I'm also wondering, could it be a conduit, right, to face-to-face recovery support engagement? Like, so the analogy we use is like dipping their toe in the water, right? They might look at the pool and say, I don't want to go there, it's too hot or it's too cold, or everybody looks like they're not having a good time or whatever, but they dip their toe in the water on this social network site, and they go, this is not that bad, and I'm engaging with people. I kind of want to get to know these people in person and then become more willing to check out a meeting, right? So I think it could be a conduit also, in addition potentially to a standalone recovery support service and maybe an adjunct to clinical services as well. We'll see. And then the last study I'll talk about is a small survey that I did on young people or young adults that were presenting to outpatient treatment for an evaluation. They had not yet engaged in treatment. And we slipped a survey about their social network site use into their evaluation packet. Only half of them did it, so I think they were sort of hip to that, and so they didn't really want to do it, but half did do it. And so I'll tell you a little about them. So here I had 3 research questions. So I was interested, really, I was kind of talking about when the talk first started, is one of my primary interest is really in how can we use these sites to help people and enhance recovery. But with any intervention, right, whether it's an FDA-approved intervention, a medication, a psychosocial treatment, what have you, we're obviously thinking about the ways it could benefit people. We also have to be thinking about the risks at the same time, and that cost-benefit or the risk-benefit ratio, and do the potential benefits outweigh any risks? And so I'm interested here in looking at when you have young adults that are showing up for an evaluation, are they using social network sites like young adults that maybe don't have a substance use disorder, right? Are they being exposed to this pro-alcohol, pro-other drug content? And then importantly, are they perceiving some kind of increase in their craving to use? On the flip side, are they already using social network sites to help enhance their recovery or sort of to help engage in health behavior change already? And does that enhance their motivation for abstinence or recovery? I really told you about the method already. Here's a little bit about the sample. So in terms of their primary substance, they're about a third, a third, a third. A third opioid primary, a third alcohol primary, and a third cannabis primary. In terms of their dependence severity, the way to contextualize that 11 out of 30, that's a Leeds dependence severity questionnaire. And so in a separate sample of 18 to 24-year-olds that went to residential treatment, that number was 18 out of 30, and this is significantly lower, so they are a little bit less severe than young adults that are showing up to resi programs. And they're really not that motivated for abstinence by and large. A lot of folks, this is a clinical program I trained at and that our research program shares an office space with. And you do get a pretty wide variability, but I would say there's a minority of young adults and teens, it's a 14 to 26-year-old program, that show up and say, I've had enough. I'm ready to go for abstinence, and I want to be in recovery. There definitely are folks like that, but they've typically had more consequences, have had a few more treatment episodes before they show up to us. The modal young adult that shows up has had consequences. They want to make a change, but they're not ready to say, yes, I'm willing to commit to a major change in the way I live my life and to try abstinence. So here are some of the findings. Almost all of them had social network site participation in the past month. And by and large, they were doing so multiple times, daily or multiple times per day. Almost 60% of them were active on social network sites an hour or more a day. When I say active, I mean posting, reading, not just sitting there with it open on their computer while they study or what have you. And here's on the bottom graph, you'll see the breakdown of what sites they were using. something to think about is this happened 2 years ago. I think if we did this study now, that Instagram number would be higher. In fact, when you look at the epi data among young adults, their Instagram participation basically rivals their Facebook participation. And the site they use most often to engage with friends tends to be Instagram, more so than Facebook. And so on the top left-hand graph, what that shows us is that of those who responded to the question, 85% said they had at least some exposure to content that was pro-alcohol or pro-other drug in the past month, right? So not all of them, but pretty close, like 85%. That being said, if you look at the graph on the bottom, almost 60% said that those who responded said they had no increased craving at all, right? I think the thing for me to think about is that might be true. Like they might not have had any increased craving, but they also had just shown up to an evaluation. They might not be very good at recognizing what a craving feels like or what a craving even is. It's just one sort of thought I had as I think about these data. And then it's sort of the flip side when you talk about ways in which these young people are using social network sites to access health content or recovery-related content. There aren't that many. That's not that common. Only 38%, but when they do use social network sites in this way, a lot of them, almost all, 13 out of 15, were experiencing an increase in their motivation for recovery. I think that's kind of interesting. The only other thing to point out here is that we did ask if they were using these recovery sites like In the Rooms and other sites like it. None of them said that they had, right, in the last month. So what that says to me is that at least when they first show up to treatment, they'll probably need some facilitation or linkage to these sites and an orientation, because it's not like they're out there in the same way that mostly everybody knows what AA is and NA, but people are not yet as familiar with these sites and their availability. So it was a small study, single setting, self-selected. It's not gonna, it wasn't rocket surgery, as a friend of mine says. And it's not going to shift any paradigms. But I think for me, I like to use it in context, again, to bring up questions around. I think for me, there certainly are risks, and we'll have to take a longitudinal look, but I bet you there are risks for young people that are showing up to treatment or collegiate recovery programs. If they're using social network sites, young adults are going to be exposed to lots of content that glorifies and romanticizes alcohol and probably other drugs. And I would bet the kind of changing landscape around marijuana will increase that number as well for pot. Like I had mentioned before, these were folks showing up to treatment. We don't really know about substance use disorder more broadly. Yeah, and I think the literature from college students that don't necessarily have SUD is informative here, and it suggests that young people are being exposed to this content and that it does have risk to increase the likelihood of drinking and other drug use. And part of the way that happens is teens and young adults are pretty bad at estimating how much their friends are drinking and using and how many of their friends are drinking and using. It's one of like the more commonly practiced and robust interventions as like a primary prevention strategy for college kids. College kid gets into trouble one time and they're going to get an intervention called personalized normative feedback, where essentially what you do is you ask them how much are they drinking and using drugs, and then you give them data about how much their peers are drinking and using drugs, and you do see a decrease. Like a light bulb doesn't necessarily go off and they're like, yeah, I'm going to get into recovery, but it's a fairly effective intervention on a broad scale. And I think the flip side is probably true. I think those in kind of early recovery, not only can it serve as a trigger, but it can overestimate the degree to which all of their friends are out drinking and drugging, and underestimate the degree to which they have friends that might be in recovery themselves or might not be drinking and drugging, the extent to which they see on social network sites. So just to recap these 3 points, the 10 minutes before the Q&A. Okay. So just to recap these 3 points. 1 in 10 US adults who have resolved the substance use problem are using online technology to do so. Those individuals have more psychosocial challenges, other service utilization that are related to recovery online tech use. That second study, the in-the-room study, participants do perceive their participation as helpful. And again, I think the most important piece of that to me was that those in early recovery or not yet in recovery still perceived their participation as beneficial as much as those with a year or more. And then the third piece, like I just mentioned, is that emerging adults or young adults with SUD who attended an outpatient evaluation, they are on social network sites as much as their quote-unquote general population counterparts, are likely to report passive exposure to substance-related content. So like I mentioned before, I'm going to close with really a series of questions more than answers. The field is relatively new, but there's a lot of work that's been done on face-to-face recovery communities. AA is the most widely known, widely attended, and also kind of widely researched. It's the recovery community about which we know the most, but there are lots of recovery communities out there, and we're starting to study those as well. And I'd like to start to take this into the online space, in as much as we think about social mechanisms of recovery-related behavior change, right? If we think about how people make changes in their substance use and the ways in which those things are social in nature, there are other mechanisms at play, but social mechanisms tend to be among the more robust. Like I mentioned before, changing up your social network, feeling like socially you can handle difficult situations. Another piece that I sort of brought up also, but only alluded to, was this identity as a person in recovery. And I think kind of recovery communities can help change that by being surrounded by people that you see and you go, I want to be like that. And the way the kind of the attributes that I think about with this person, they're positive, and I want to move towards that, right? So the major questions for me is, can we use the online space in a similar way, given its ubiquity and its accessibility? So here are some questions for now, right? These are questions I think that myself and others who do this work can answer in the next few years with the right research. So first and foremost for me is, does participation on these sites actually confer added benefit over and above what they're already doing? If so, in what ways, on which sites? And then the other piece is, if there is benefit, how do we facilitate participation, right? How do we link people to these sites in such a way that's going to keep them going? Dropout is a problem for every recovery support service, whether you're talking about treatment, AA, doesn't matter. And how our biggest challenge as a field is how to is not necessarily getting people to go. It's keeping people engaged is a major challenge. The second question for me is, are these sites better for certain subgroups of individuals, certain subgroups of emerging adults, for example? I mentioned those potentially who are not so motivated for abstinence. Maybe participating in this community and seeing and hearing and talking to people that are abstinent might help increase their motivation for abstinence. Can it substitute for traditional services? Is it going to be a conduit for these face-to-face services, like I mentioned, this kind of toe in the water analogy? And then the real challenge, and this is the question I get from everybody, is like, well, yeah, cool, Brandon, but how are you going to measure these things? It's the online space, and that is one of the challenges, but there are people that are much smarter than me, more computer sciencey than me, that I plan to collaborate with. And funny enough, like, we have been measuring social processes in recovery for a long time, primarily by asking people, and it's a fairly reliable way. Are there ways in which that's limited? Sure. What social network sites will allow us to do is actually get a digital footprint of those social interactions in a way that we never have been able to do before. So we can actually get a sense of, how does someone's social network and the recovery network look in the kind of online recovery space? What are their online reactions like, or online interactions like? Are they engaged in the recovery community? Are they participating in some of these services like live online video meetings, et cetera? You know, in a way that we never have before, we're able to get some objective measurement of these social processes, which I think is a major advantage of the online space. So I have a study that's proposed, and I hope to get funding for really within the next few weeks. And so, like, in my perfect world, I'll run this study and I'll come back in a few years and tell you about it, or come back next year, although it probably won't be done by then. But I'm going to take 200 emerging adults with a moderate severe alcohol use disorder. I'm starting in the treatment space, even though I'm also interested not only in treatment, but also outside of treatment, and engage them in these recovery-specific social network sites. And then the other half, we won't The design is, again, I don't have time to get into why we're not doing a quote-unquote randomized controlled trial. The long and the short of it is if you do a study in a treatment program and you randomize half the people to get the thing and the other half not to get the thing, and the people in the treatment program start to talk to each other, the intervention is not going to be effective, right? It's going to dilute the potency of that intervention. So they call it contamination, which I always think is such a negative-sounding word. And then I want to measure their outcomes over time, both with these objective markers of their social interactions, drug toxicology screens, breathalyzers to get a validation of their self-report of substance use, and actually get a sense empirically, does participation on these sites confer benefit or predict better outcomes over and above their involvement in treatment, face-to-face meetings, et cetera. And so I'll close with just a few questions for later, and then if you guys have questions for me about these questions, so I'm trying to leave a few minutes at the end. So for me, it's also about how do we take these social network site platforms and combine them with things that we already know to be helpful. So there are lots of empirically supported interventions, for example, for substance use disorder. Does it make a difference to link somebody to an online community where they not only get that social support, but there are also empirically supported interventions, cognitive behavioral interventions, 12-step facilitation interventions, motivational enhancement that they can interact with? And so what is the optimal experience here? Can it be personalized based on somebody's individual needs? How do we reach people outside of treatment settings? We're notoriously, as a field, we have a very tough time with that. We know so much more about people with SUD that go to treatment than people with SUD that don't go to treatment. Our AA research is a really good example of that. The substantial majority of our research on AA comes from treatment-seeking samples. We know very little about folks that just go straight to AA. And then this third bullet, and I swear I had this up before the whole Facebook Cambridge Analytica controversy, but this is a question that I get a lot, right, is like, how do you talk to patients about ensuring their privacy when it comes to these sites? And I'm like, well, I can't. And I do think that needs to be an important part of the conversation, is what are the ethical issues of this? Now, I will say, like, if you talk to like college students, or at least when I do, they don't really care about their privacy. It's just not a world they grew up in. We care a whole lot more about their privacy than they do. I don't know if that's going to be true necessarily for folks that are in treatment recovery. So I'm just bringing this up really as a question to talk about. And then the second piece is, so there is this parallel research empirical line of investigation. That's not what I'm doing, looking at smartphone addiction and internet addiction, right? And so you think about people with a substance use disorder, and they have that neurobiological vulnerability, right, to kind of impairments in reward circuitry and impairments in control and things like that. And so there is this line of research that's happening in parallel, but completely separate from this literature that I'm interested in on how we can use technology to help people. And so we're saying, like, yeah, technology is going to help people, and we're going to just start driving everybody with a substance use disorder to be using smartphones and the internet and stuff like that. And so for me, again, as I mentioned before, it's important to understand not only what are the potential benefits of this in terms of enhancing recovery outcomes, but are there potential risks, and weighing the potential benefits against those risks. And so there I just mentioned, even though I didn't talk about those data, if you used these recovery online tech resources I talked about in the first study, even when you controlled for all these demographic factors, they had a higher likelihood of a history of self-reported internet addiction, right? That doesn't mean that they necessarily had problematic internet use. That's just how they identified. So I only say that to say it's an important question that we need to take a look at. That's it in terms of, here are some acknowledgments. The last thing I'll say, so I'm a researcher at the Recovery Research Institute. We do our own original research, but part of our mission is to take the science on treatment and recovery. It's a nonprofit mission, a nonprofit initiative. Take the science on treatment and recovery and translate into formats that are more engaging and consumable for the general public, for clinicians, for policymakers, for other scientists. We have a free monthly newsletter, and so if a little shameless plug for recoveryanswers.org, you can go on and sign up for our free newsletter. We have all sorts of content on there about how to access treatment, how to understand the science of treatment, and so I just wanted to plug that also. Okay, now I'm done.